We accept it without question. The 40-hour work week, the daily grind, the alarm clock pulling us from sleep to spend our waking hours in labor. We're told this is natural. This is how civilization functions. This is the price of progress. But what if it isn't natural at all? What if the world of constant labor we inhabit is actually a regression? What if humans once lived very differently, with technology so advanced that the backbreaking work we consider normal was almost entirely unnecessary? I started asking questions about labor history that nobody seemed to want answered. Not questions about unions or wages or working conditions. Deeper questions. Questions about why we work at all. Questions about whether the fundamental structure of human labor might be hiding something about the world that came before. And what I found suggests that our current relationship with work isn't the product of progress. It's the product of loss. The loss of technology that once freed humans from most physical labor. The loss of systems that provided energy and resources without constant human effort. The loss of a world where the Tartarian workday looked nothing like the exhausting grind we've been taught to accept as inevitable. The evidence is hiding in plain sight, in the buildings that couldn't have been constructed by the workforce supposedly available, in the infrastructure that shouldn't exist given the labor capacity of attributed populations, in the persistent myths of golden ages when humans didn't toil from dawn to dusk. Something freed our ancestors from labor, and when that something was lost, we inherited a world of work that would have seemed like slavery to those who came before. Let me start with a paradox that historians refuse to address. The 19th century supposedly saw the greatest construction boom in human history. Massive buildings rising in every major city, infrastructure projects spanning continents, railways crossing nations, canals linking waterways, architecture of unprecedented scale and sophistication appearing within decades. The official narrative credits industrialization, steam power multiplying human effort, new machines enabling new possibilities, progress marching forward through technological advancement. But here's the problem. The labor force doesn't match the output. Census records from the mid-1800s show surprisingly small urban populations. Construction labor was a fraction of modern equivalents. Such the tools available were supposedly primitive compared to what we use today, yet the buildings constructed during this period exceed anything we build now in craftsmanship and often in scale. The decorative stonework alone on a single 19th century building would require thousands of skilled craftsmen working for years. Multiply that across the thousands of monumental buildings supposedly constructed simultaneously, and the math simply doesn't work. Where did the labor come from to build these structures? How did small populations accomplish what modern cities with millions of residents and advanced machinery cannot replicate? The standard answer is that we've simply lost the skills, that craftsmen of the past possessed knowledge we no longer have, that patient, dedicated labor over long periods achieved what now seems impossible. But this explanation inverts logic. We're asked to believe that less advanced societies with smaller populations and primitive tools outperformed modern civilization with its billions of people and sophisticated machinery. Unless the assumption is wrong, unless those societies weren't less advanced, unless they had access to something we don't, consider what it would actually take to construct a single building of the type that appeared in hundreds during the supposed 19th century construction boom. Take a typical Tartarian-style structure, multiple stories of precisely cut stone, elaborate decorative elements on every surface, columns with perfect proportions, cornices with intricate carved details, windows framed with ornamental stonework, rooflines featuring sophisticated metalwork. To build such a structure today using period-appropriate methods would require an army of skilled craftsmen, stone cutters, stone setters, sculptors, metalworkers, carpenters, glass workers, each trade requiring years of training, each element requiring weeks or months of dedicated work. A single decorative capital atop a column might require a skilled sculptor working for a month. A building with 50 columns has 50 capitals. That's over 4 years of skilled sculptural labor just for the column capitals of one building. Now multiply this across every decorative element, the cornices, the window frames, the doorway surrounds, the roofline ornaments, the interior details. A single monumental building would require tens of thousands of hours of skilled craftsman labor, hundreds of workers for years. Now consider that cities supposedly built dozens of such buildings simultaneously. Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco, London, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, St. Petersburg, all experiencing the same construction boom at the same time. The workforce required would exceed the total population of these cities. Not just exceed the construction workforce, exceed the entire population, including women, children, elderly, and those in other occupations. The numbers are impossible, unless construction didn't require the labor we assume it did. The Tartarian technology hypothesis provides an answer. What if the civilization that actually built these structures possessed technology that dramatically reduced the human labor required? What if construction that would take us years could be accomplished in weeks through methods we no longer understand. We've documented in previous investigations the evidence for advanced Tartarian technology, atmospheric energy harvesting, acoustic engineering, sophisticated understanding of materials and resonance, buildings that appear designed as machines rather than simple shelters. What if this technology extended to construction itself? What if the Tartarians possessed methods of shaping stone, moving materials, and assembling structures that made our current techniques look as primitive as they actually are? The evidence suggests exactly this. Stonework on Tartarian buildings frequently displays characteristics that modern stonemasons cannot explain. Cuts too precise for hand tools, joints too tight for manual fitting, curves too perfect for traditional shaping methods, surfaces too smooth for period-appropriate finishing techniques. When experts examine this stonework, they attribute it to lost skills or superior craftsmanship. But these aren't explanations. They're admissions that the work shouldn't be possible given the tools and techniques supposedly available. The simpler explanation is that different tools and techniques were used. Technology that made precision cutting effortless, methods that shaped stone like soft clay, systems that assembled massive blocks as easily as we stack children's toys. If such technology existed, the construction paradox dissolves. A small workforce with advanced tools could accomplish what would require massive labor using primitive methods. The buildings weren't built by armies of craftsmen toiling for years. They were built quickly, efficiently, by a civilization that had largely automated the construction process. This brings us to the broader question of Tartarian labor. If technology reduced construction labor to a fraction of what we'd expect, the same principle likely applied across all forms of work: agriculture, manufacturing, transportation. The entire structure of daily effort would have been fundamentally different. What would society look like if most physical labor was unnecessary? The clues are in the buildings themselves, not just how they were constructed, but how they were designed to be used. Tartarian architecture features vast public spaces, enormous halls with soaring ceilings, grand promenades and covered walkways, parks and gardens of remarkable scale, the infrastructure of leisure, not labor. Compare this to industrial architecture: factories with low ceilings to conserve heat, cramped worker housing stacked for efficiency, cities designed around the needs of production, not human comfort. The contrast suggests two very different societies: one organized around human well-being, with abundant space and beauty; another organized around labor extraction, with every element designed to maximize productive output. We're told the beautiful buildings came first, constructed by societies that were somehow both more primitive and more capable of aesthetic achievement. Then came the factories, the product of progress and advancement. But what if the sequence is reversed? What if the beautiful buildings represent a more advanced civilization, one where technology freed humans for leisure and aesthetic pursuits? What if the factories represent regression, the desperate attempt of a less advanced society to replace lost technology with brute human labor? The historical record contains persistent references to a world before constant toil. Every culture has myths of a golden age, a time when humans didn't labor from dawn to dusk, when the earth provided abundantly without backbreaking cultivation, when life was characterized by ease rather than endless work. We're taught to dismiss these as wishful fantasies, primitive people imagining a better past because their present was harsh, mythology with no basis in historical reality. But the myths are remarkably consistent across cultures that had no contact with each other, and they often contain specific details about how this easier life was achieved. Stories of devices that provided food without farming, accounts of machines that performed labor without human effort, legends of energy that flowed freely, powering the needs of civilization without constant human input. These aren't vague fantasies about magical abundance. They're descriptions of technology that freed humans from labor. What if the myths are memories? What if they preserve genuine knowledge of a world before the reset, when Tartarian technology made most work unnecessary? The transition from the Tartarian world to our world of constant labor would have been catastrophic. Imagine a society where technology provides most necessities. Food production is largely automated. Construction requires minimal human input. Energy flows freely from atmospheric sources. So the average person works perhaps a few hours per day, if that, contributing to society in ways that feel meaningful rather than grinding. Now imagine that technology failing, the atmospheric energy systems collapsing, the automated systems breaking down, the infrastructure that provided abundance suddenly ceasing to function. The survivors would face a world where the old methods no longer worked, but the old technology was gone. They would have to learn or relearn how to do everything through human labor. This isn't progress. This is catastrophic regression, a fall from technological civilization into a world where brute human effort is the only remaining source of productivity. The factories of the Industrial Revolution weren't advances. They were desperate attempts to replace lost technology with human bodies. The grinding labor of the 19th and 20th centuries wasn't the price of progress. It was the consequence of collapse. We didn't climb up to where we are. We fell down to here and have been slowly, painfully climbing back. The evidence for this interpretation appears in the structure of early industrial labor. When factories first appeared, they didn't attract workers. They had to coerce them. People resisted factory labor with everything they had. They preferred poverty to the grinding rhythm of industrial work. This resistance is usually explained as simple preference for traditional lifestyles. Farmers didn't want to become factory workers. Craftsmen didn't want to become machine operators. But the resistance was more fundamental than occupational preference. People experienced factory labor as something deeply wrong, unnatural, inhuman. A violation of how life was supposed to be lived. What if this wasn't mere conservatism? What if people in the early industrial period still carried some memory, however faded, of how life had been before? What if factory labor felt wrong because it was wrong? A brutal regression from a world where such grinding toil hadn't existed. The violence required to create an industrial workforce suggests that humans don't naturally accept lives of constant labor. Children were forced into factories. Workers were compelled through starvation. Laws were passed criminalizing traditional ways of living that didn't involve wage labor. The industrial system wasn't built through attraction. It was built through force. Because humans don't naturally choose lives of endless work, they have to be made to accept them. The Tartarian workday, based on the evidence I've assembled, looked nothing like our own. In a society with advanced technology providing most necessities, the concept of work would be fundamentally different. Labor wouldn't mean exhausting effort to meet basic survival needs. It would mean contribution to social and cultural life. The massive public buildings suggest a society with abundant leisure time. You don't build elaborate cultural spaces for people who spend every waking hour in survival labor. You build them for people with time to enjoy them. The sophisticated arts and craftsmanship preserved from the Tartarian period suggest a population with extensive time for skill development. The level of aesthetic achievement visible in their architecture requires not just talent but leisure, time to develop skills, time to perfect techniques, time to create beauty for its own sake. The grand public parks and gardens suggest a society that valued recreation and contemplation, open spaces for gathering, for celebration, for the simple enjoyment of being alive. None of this fits with a society of grinding labor. All of it fits with a society where technology had freed humans for higher pursuits. The Tartarian workday might have involved a few hours of meaningful contribution, maintaining systems, creating art, teaching knowledge, participating in governance, activities that engaged human capabilities rather than grinding them down. The rest of the day would have been leisure, time with family, time for learning, time for the activities that make life worth living. This isn't utopian fantasy. It's what technology is supposed to provide. It's what we were promised automation would deliver. It's what we should have achieved by now, given the productive capacity of modern civilization. Instead, we work more than medieval peasants. We have less leisure than ancient hunter-gatherers. We've built machines that multiply human productivity 1,000-fold. Yet somehow we're more exhausted than ever. Something went wrong. Something was lost. And we've been told to accept the loss as normal. The energy systems of the Tartarian civilization were key to their liberation from labor. We've documented the evidence for atmospheric energy harvesting in previous investigations. The spires and domes and antenna systems visible on Tartarian buildings. The sophisticated engineering that appears designed to capture and distribute electrical energy from the atmosphere itself. Free energy would transform the economics of labor entirely. Consider how much of modern work exists only because energy costs money. We work to pay for the electricity that powers our homes. We work to buy the fuel that moves our vehicles. We work to afford the heating and cooling that makes our buildings habitable. If energy were free, a vast portion of economic activity would simply be unnecessary. The labor currently devoted to energy extraction, processing, distribution, and payment would vanish. The work we do to pay energy costs would be freed for other purposes. Now extend this principle to manufacturing. If energy is free and abundant, production costs drop dramatically. Goods become cheap or essentially free. The labor devoted to purchasing goods decreases proportionally. Free energy doesn't just reduce some work. It transforms the entire structure of economic necessity. It makes possible a society where basic needs are met without constant labor, where humans work because they choose to, not because survival demands it. The Tartarians apparently had this. The evidence in their buildings suggests energy systems that provided abundant power without the massive infrastructure we require. They solved the energy problem, and solving the energy problem meant solving the labor problem. The reset didn't just destroy buildings and erase memories, it destroyed the energy infrastructure that made Tartarian society possible. When the atmospheric energy systems failed, whether through catastrophe or deliberate destruction, the survivors faced a world where nothing worked the way it used to. The automated systems that had provided necessities stopped functioning. The free energy that had powered civilization was no longer available. The technology that had freed humans from labor became useless without the power to operate it. The survivors had to start over. And starting over meant relying on the one energy source that doesn't require technology: human muscle. The explosion of human labor that characterizes the industrial period wasn't progress, it was desperation. The attempt to replace lost energy systems with human bodies. The brutal calculation that if machines no longer worked, people would have to serve as machines instead. This explains the resistance to industrial labor. People weren't just reluctant to change occupations, they were being asked to perform functions that machines had previously performed. To become the power source for systems designed to use other kinds of energy. The factories weren't advances in human capability. They were adaptations to catastrophic loss, primitive replacements for sophisticated systems that no longer functioned. The knowledge of how to restore the old systems was systematically suppressed. We've documented in previous investigations the evidence for coordinated erasure of Tartarian knowledge. The children institutionalized and reprogrammed. The witnesses committed to asylums. The records destroyed. The alternative narratives pathologized. The energy technology would have been a primary target of this suppression. If people understood how the old systems worked, they might try to rebuild them. They might refuse to accept lives of grinding labor when they knew another way was possible. The knowledge had to be not just lost, but actively forgotten. People had to believe that free energy was impossible, that constant labor was natural, that the world they inherited was the only world that could exist. This required more than destroying machines and documents. It required reshaping human consciousness, making people believe that work was virtuous, that leisure was sinful, that exhaustion was the proper state of human existence. The Protestant work ethic wasn't just a religious development. It was programming, ideological infrastructure for a world where humans had to replace lost technology with their own bodies. If you believe work is virtuous, you won't question why you're working. If you believe leisure is sinful, you won't demand the free time that technology should provide. If you believe exhaustion is noble, you'll accept conditions that would otherwise seem intolerable. The work ethic was the software update required to run human beings as machines. The evidence appears in how we've handled subsequent technological development. Every major technological advance of the past 2 centuries has promised to reduce human labor. Steam power, electricity, internal combustion, computing, automation, artificial intelligence. Each technology has delivered on this promise in terms of productive capacity. We can produce more with less human input than ever before in recorded history. Yet somehow, we're not working less, we're working more. Or if we're working similar hours, we're working with greater intensity, greater stress, greater exhaustion. Where does the productivity go? The gains from technology don't flow to workers in the form of reduced labor. They flow somewhere else, to profits, to growth, to the expansion of systems that demand ever more human input despite having ever more machine capacity. It's as if something in the structure of our civilization prevents technology from freeing us, as if the system is designed to capture productivity gains before they can reduce human labor. What if this isn't accidental? What if the economic structures we've inherited were specifically designed to prevent technology from liberating workers? What if the lesson learned from the Tartarian period was that free humans with abundant leisure are dangerous, and the post-reset civilization was engineered to prevent that situation from recurring? The Tartarians had free energy and minimal labor. And something happened to them, something catastrophic. Whether that catastrophe was natural or engineered, the survivors or inheritors drew a lesson from it. Never let the population be free again. This interpretation explains anomalies in economic history that otherwise make no sense. Why did the Industrial Revolution, which massively increased productive capacity, also massively increase working hours? Early industrial workers labored far longer than medieval peasants. Children worked in mines and factories for 14-hour days. If technology increases productivity, labor should decrease. That's basic logic. But the opposite happened. The standard explanation involves complex economic factors: capital accumulation, market competition, the dynamics of early industrialization. But these explanations assume the goal was efficiency. What if the goal was something else? What if the point wasn't to produce goods efficiently, but to keep humans laboring constantly? From this perspective, the brutal working conditions of early industrialization weren't inefficiencies to be corrected. They were features, deliberate designs ensuring that technological productivity couldn't translate into human freedom. The labor movement won certain concessions over time: the 8-hour day, the weekend, basic safety protections. But these concessions were carefully calibrated, enough to prevent revolution, not enough to actually free people from constant labor. We got the 40-hour week when technology could have given us the 4-hour week. We got 2 days off when we could have had 5. We got retirement at 65 when we could have had it at 30. The gains from technology were captured and redirected, always ensuring that humans remained bound to labor despite the machines that should have freed them. The Tartarian buildings that survive are monuments to a different relationship with work. Look at the public libraries built in the late 1800s. Massive structures with soaring reading rooms, elaborate decoration throughout, spaces designed for contemplation and learning. We're told these were built by industrialists as gifts to the working public. Carnegie and his libraries. The philanthropy of the wealthy sharing culture with the masses. But the buildings themselves suggest a different story. Their scale and sophistication imply a society where learning and leisure were central values, not afterthoughts provided by wealthy patrons, but fundamental priorities reflected in monumental architecture. What if these libraries weren't gifts from industrialists to workers? What if they were remnants of a Tartarian society where everyone had time to read, to learn, to engage with culture? What if the industrial period simply repurposed buildings designed for a population with abundant leisure? The same question applies to concert halls, museums, public gardens, and grand civic buildings, all of them suggesting a society that valued human flourishing over productive output, all of them now awkwardly fitted into a civilization that claims to value work above all. We use Tartarian buildings for purposes they weren't designed for, and we've forgotten what they were actually designed for. The recovery of Tartarian technology would mean the recovery of Tartarian leisure. If we could rebuild the atmospheric energy systems, if we could restore the sophisticated technology that made labor unnecessary, we could reclaim the kind of life the Tartarians apparently lived. Work would become optional, or at least drastically reduced. The coercion that keeps us laboring would lose its power. The economic systems designed to capture productivity would become obsolete. This is why the technology remains suppressed, not because it doesn't work, but because it works too well, because it would make possible a world where humans are free. And free humans, as the Tartarian example apparently demonstrated, are dangerous to certain kinds of power. The secret isn't that free energy is impossible. The secret is that free energy would make free people. And free people don't submit to lives of endless labor for the benefit of those who control the systems of production. The Tartarian workday represents a threat to every structure of power based on controlling human labor. If people learn that constant work isn't necessary, isn't natural, isn't inevitable, they might stop accepting it. And so the knowledge stays buried, the technology stays suppressed, the 40-hour week stays standard, despite centuries of productivity growth that should have ended it long ago. But the evidence survives. In buildings too sophisticated for the labor force supposedly available. In architecture designed for leisure rather than production. In myths of golden ages that persist despite every attempt to dismiss them. The Tartarians showed that another way is possible. A world where technology serves humanity rather than enslaving it, where the benefits of productivity flow to workers rather than being captured by systems of control, where the purpose of civilization is human flourishing rather than endless extraction. That world existed. The evidence surrounds us. The buildings they left behind testify to a different relationship between humans and work. And if it existed once, it can exist again. The 40-hour week isn't natural law. It's a political choice, a choice made by those who benefit from human labor and enforced through economic systems designed to prevent alternatives. The Tartarian workday of a few hours of meaningful contribution wasn't utopian fantasy. It was technological reality, the default condition of advanced civilization. What humans naturally achieve when technology is allowed to serve human needs rather than being captured by systems of extraction. We've been told that constant labor is the price of civilization. The evidence suggests the opposite. Constant labor is the consequence of lost civilization, the brutal adaptation to a world where advanced technology was destroyed and humans had to replace it with their own bodies. The next time you drag yourself out of bed for another day of work, remember what was lost. A world where the alarm clock didn't exist because there was no need to regiment human time, where mornings were for waking naturally, not for rushing to labor, where the day stretched ahead as an opportunity for living, not a sentence to be served. The Tartarians had this. The buildings prove it. The impossibility of constructing their architecture with grinding human labor proves it. The leisure spaces and cultural institutions and public gardens prove it. They solved the problem we keep being told can't be solved. They freed themselves from unnecessary labor. They built a civilization where technology served human flourishing. And then something happened, something that destroyed not just the buildings and the technology, but the very memory that such a world was possible. We inherited the ruins. We were taught that the ruins represented progress. We were programmed to accept lives of labor that the Tartarians would have seen as slavery. The secret isn't complicated. Advanced technology reduces the need for human labor. The Tartarians had advanced technology. Therefore, Tartarians didn't need to spend their lives in grinding work. We could have this again. We have more productive capacity now than the Tartarians ever did, at least potentially. The technology exists to free humanity from most labor within a generation. But the technology keeps being captured. The productivity keeps being redirected. The 40-hour week persists despite every advancement that should have ended it. Because someone learned from the Tartarian example, learned that free people are dangerous, learned that abundance threatens certain kinds of power, learned that the best way to control a population is to keep them too exhausted to question their conditions. The Tartarian workday is the secret they don't want you to know about, not because it was impossible, but because it was achieved. Not because technology can't free us, but because it already did once, and the memory had to be erased. The evidence is in the buildings, in the impossible construction, in the leisure spaces and cultural institutions, in every ornate detail that couldn't have been carved by workers grinding through 14-hour days. The Tartarians worked a few hours a day, if that. The Tartarians had time for art and learning and culture and life. The Tartarians solved the problem of labor, and everything that came after has been designed to ensure we never solve it again. Until we remember, until we see the evidence that surrounds us, until we understand that another world is possible, because it already existed, and the proof is hiding in plain sight.